World of Warcraft is a game built around the Holy Trinity. This means that tanks take damage, healers heal that damage, and DPS do damage to stuff. This fundamental design has existed since the game launched back in 2004 with the original 9 classes. Over the years we've seen an expansion of new classes too, which can also fulfill these roles, such as Death Knights, Monks, Demon Hunters, and most recently Evokers. So whilst the Holy Trinity's been added to, it's always been the cornerstone of World of Warcraft's combat. And within this Holy Trinity, different classes are bringing different strengths, and a balanced raid composition of a bunch of different classes should give you the best results. Classes are designed to rely on one another through buffs, debuffs, and unique utility. But here's the thing, that is not always the case in this game. Sometimes one class or spec is just way better than others. Maybe Blizzard overtuned something in a patch and took a while to nerf it, or maybe a boss mechanic synergizes perfectly with a singular class's toolkit. Or it could be any of the above to create a perfect storm of just one class or spec being crazy overpowered, and as a result stacked instead of us seeing a ton of class diversity. And that's what we'll be talking about today, 10 times when class stacking completely broke World of Warcraft raid bosses across any version of the game, all the way from vanilla to modern World of Warcraft. These will be 10 moments when the best thing to do was to bring as many of one class or spec as possible. So with that said, let's make a start. We'll begin in the Burning Crusade. It's an expansion that we're going to be revisiting pretty quickly, and it's no secret, whether it was back in the day or during Classic, that Shamans were one of the singular most desired classes in the game. Now Shamans have always been valuable because of their totems and utility, but in TBC they reached a whole new level of importance thanks to one brand new ability, Bloodlust, or Heroism if you were Alliance. Bloodlust back then increased haste by 30% for everyone in your group for 40 seconds and had a 10-minute cooldown. But here was the key detail where things were different in the future. There was no exhaustion debuff in Burning Crusade like there was in Wrath of the Lich King and beyond. This meant if you had a bunch of Shamans, you could rotate them into the same group and maintain that Bloodlust buff for your top DPS for the entire fight. Guilds would have several Shamans in their raid positioned in different groups for their totems, and when it was time to Bloodlust your group, they'd move the Shaman into the group with the top DPS, usually Destruction Warlocks, maybe BM Hunters, even Warriors later on into the expansion. The Shaman would cast Bloodlust and then be moved back into their original groups because that original group would still want their totems. And before that Bloodlust would wear off, you'd swap another one in and just keep rotating them. Even your average raid in TBC would want 5 Shamans, and raids were 25 players large at that point in time. But to really ensure full uptime on Bloodlust, you could easily go to 7 or to 8 Shamans in any single raid. And of course, top guilds looking to speedrun or pass would absolutely use this to their advantage. But TBC must have been the expansion where Shamans were the most stacked in World of Warcraft's history, with every single raid wanting at least 5 and you being able to go up to 7 to 8 quite comfortably. Moving forwards to the Cataclysm, we've got one of the most memorable class stacking moments from Dragon Soul, where a combination of Arcane Mages and Subtlety Rogues took on the heroic Spine of Deathwing encounter. So Spine was an absolutely brutal fight when it was current content. The heroic version had a DPS check that was really difficult to beat early on. You need to defeat Burning Tendons during an extremely short DPS window when they were exposed, and if you didn't do this fast enough, you would have to repeat the motions to expose them again, and it would extend the fight, often leading to a wipe. And these Tendons had so much health that you really had to prioritize specs which could deal the absolute most burst damage possible, and burst damage is what Arcane Mage and Subtlety Rogues did best. At this point in time, both specs had access to legendary weapons too. Rogues could obtain Fangs of the Father, and Arcane Mages could get Dragon Wrath. But on top of the legendaries, both specs excelled at short, high burst windows, which is exactly what Spine demanded. Sub-rogues could use their burst window with Shadow Dance and Vanish to pump out massive damage, and Arcane Mages would line up Arcane Power and other unused effects. Back in the day, this was one of the biggest events of class stacking we saw for the world first first kill of the heroic Spine of Deathwing, where the raid composition brought 5 subtlety rogues and 7 arcane mages. That's nearly half the raid's DPS spots on 2 particular specs, just to be able to beat the DPS check. What made this interesting is it wasn't just about these specs being necessarily overpowered at the time, they just had the perfect toolkit to line up with what the fight demanded, and they could both have legendaries, which definitely helped the scenario too. This forced guilds to stack rogues and mages to even have a realistic chance to beat the boss, and indeed back in the day many people considered Spine of Deathwing to be more difficult than the last encounter Madness of Deathwing just because of this DPS check. Now we're heading many expansions into the future all the way to Battle for Azeroth, and we're going to be seeing rogues being broken again. Spoiler alert, it turns out Rogue is pretty overpowered in this game, but the raid Uldir gave us one of the most blatant examples of class stacking in recent memory with the encounter Mythic Zul. This fight, if you were doing it the intended way, was really difficult to do correctly, as things could just go wrong so easily. But again, subtlety rogues were completely busted on this fight. The reason for this was a passive they had called Shuriken Combo. This made it so when they used Fan of Knives, when it hit multiple targets, you'd generate 1 combo point per target hit. And on Zul, you were meant to keep a bunch of ads out of the fight so you could control them, but instead you just keep the ads on top of the boss, and sub-rogues would spam Fan of Knives and then eviscerate. Your entire rotation for the fight will be Fan of Knives, eviscerate, and just repeat. Essentially, they were using these ads to pad their single target damage massively. Top guilds went all in on this strategy because it completely trivialized the fight. I even did this fight with a guild back then playing a sub-rogue ult, and I completely smashed everyone else on the damage meters because it was just so overpowered. Method used 5 sub-rogues in their 20-man mythic raid, and of course Audio was the first Race to World First that was done live by Method as well, so people really got a good insight into some of the strategies and creative ways people found of beating bosses. This strategy was so effective because it basically trivialized the second phase of the fight, which was supposed to be the difficult part. Guilds that stacked rogues could just brute force through Zul's DPS check without dealing with all the complicated mechanics that they should have had to. However, Blizzard were not happy about this strategy, and they would go on to nerf sub-rogues significantly. In fact, sub-rogue as an entire spec would suffer for quite a long time because of their performance on Zul. Nevertheless, the damage had been done, and a lot of guilds were able to progress through this raid onto more difficult bosses. But for a moment, rogues were able to show how having this very niche strength could be super effective. Now I want to talk about some class stacking that was actually done during Wrath of the Lich King Classic, specifically in the Naxxramas raid during the Race to World First in that event. And this was when the brand new class proved itself to still be completely busted on a re-release, and here we're talking specifically about Unholy Death Knight. During the Race for the World First Naxxramas 25-man, the World First guild will bring 10 Death Knights to their 25-man composition. This spec could do pretty much everything. It had great single target damage, it had excellent cleave from spreading their diseases about, a permanent ghoul pet thanks to Master of Ghouls, and above all, Summon Gargoyle as your major DPS cooldown that benefited from your current haste value when it was cast. Now, Unholy DKs would optimize their gear for the highest haste values possible. You would have things such as your Meta Gem, your Haste Tinker from Engineering, unused trinkets, Bloodlust, and so on. And when everything lined up and you press Summon Gargoyle, that thing would do unreal amounts of damage. In fact, Summon Gargoyle with haste snapshotting was so overpowered that Blizzard actually went and nerfed it in a later patch. There's something else that people often forget about for Wrath Classic 2, which was a big deal here. When encounters ended or you defeated them, all of your cooldowns were reset. This didn't happen back in the day. It wasn't a thing until Cataclysm, I believe. So you had this class which was entirely dependent on snapshotting every single cooldown in the game, and they had every single cooldown in the game for every boss, making them even more completely busted than they already were. Despite the nerfs though, Death Knight would still be a core part of every single raid comp for World First and Wrath Classic moving forwards, but in Naxxramas in particular, they showed just how truly overpowered they were. And if we're talking about class stacking, we do have to bring up Warriors in Vanilla here at some point in time. I would have put this higher on the list, but really everyone knows about stacking Warriors in Vanilla, but all the same they deserve a spot just because of how broken they are. A key reason why is in vanilla, rage generation works differently than it does in later expansions. Warriors generated rage based upon the damage they dealt with their auto attacks, and if you dealt more damage, you got more rage, and more rage meant more abilities, which meant more damage. It was a feedback loop that scaled exponentially with gear. This means warriors are infamously rather weak when they're leveling or without world buffs, but once you start to get pre-biss and some world buffs, you just become the best class in the game by a mile. And in every version of vanilla ever, warriors will always be the top damage dealer, pretty much because of how the rage mechanic works. But there was more to it than just rage. Warriors had other advantages. Weapon skill in vanilla was an important stat that back in the day went underappreciated for a long time. Humans and orcs had racial bonuses that gave them +5 to their respective weapon types they benefited from. This didn't just increase their hit chance, it also reduced the penalty from glancing blows against boss level enemies. Essentially what this means is they have to itemize for less hit, and their auto attacks deal more damage on average. 5 extra weapon skills sounds small, but it's in fact a absolutely massive advantage, and it's why you'll see the majority of warriors in vanilla always being orc or human. And on WoW Classic Anniversary realms, guilds are breaking records all again stacking warriors. For example, the guild Squawk achieved a Ragnaros kill in just 18 seconds using 23 warriors in their 40-man raid. Other guilds will regularly bring up to 10 warriors easily in their raid comps, and there are many instances of bosses dying in under 10 seconds because of warrior class stacking in Anniversary, and these warriors are even gearing in a unique way as well. The boss kill times are so low that they are able to have 100% uptime on recklessness, meaning they have 100% crit chance. So aside from having hit cap, they don't need to gear for crits because recklessness is doing it. These warriors are getting the fastest kill times in the world using greens that have of strength on them from the auction house. That's the state warriors are at right now. Nevertheless, warriors absolutely deserve a spot on this list as the DPS kings of vanilla and probably one of the most stacked classes ever. Let's head forwards again into Ulduar during Wrath of the Lich King. It was widely considered to be one of the best raids ever made, and the most difficult fight in there was Yogg-Saron Zero Keepers, aka Alone in the Dark. This was, at the time, the hardest boss fight in World of Warcraft's history, but the guild Stars achieved the world first kill, and they did it with a very specific strategy, stacking Affliction Warlocks. Yogg-Saron Zero Lights was a mechanically brutal encounter, and the hardest phase by far was the last one. In this final phase, you were running against the clock as the boss would continually spawn more adds. Eventually these adds would overwhelm your tank and then just run through the raid and absolutely destroy you in a matter of seconds. On top of that, the boss would frequently cast something called Lunatic Gaze. This would give you a debuff if you are facing towards the boss, and if your sanity ever drained to 0, you would become permanently mind controlled for the remainder of the fight. This created a big problem. You needed to do as much damage as possible in this phase, but you also needed to be able to do this damage whilst not facing the boss. The answer was Affliction Warlocks. As a damage over time based spec, Affliction can cast pretty much every single ability in their toolkit without having to face the boss. For damage over time effects such as Corruption or Unstable Affliction, you don't need to face the boss, for example. Abilities you did need to face the boss for were Haunt and the initial cast of Drained Soul, but once Drain started you can turn away and it continues channeling. On top of that, Affliction Warlocks were the best execute spec in the entire game. It was like their kit was tailor-made to be perfect on this fight. Stars, for example, brought 5 Affliction Warlocks to their 25-man raid, and any guild seriously progressing on Yogg-Zero wanted as many Warlocks as they could possibly get. In fact, even in Wrath Classic all those years later, guilds attempting kills week 1 were bringing anywhere from 5 to 7 Warlocks for the exact same reasons. The guild Stars themselves said in interviews after their kill that Affliction Warlocks were the most valuable class for this encounter. They also noted the fight was more focused on execution and player skill than anything else, but having that right class composition with multiple Warlocks was still crucial to their success. In fact, they themselves said this fight was harder than anything in the Sunwell, and I've done both of them too, and I'm rather inclined to agree. Now let's jump forwards a few expansions. Tomb of Sargeras in Legion featured one of the longest and most grueling race to world firsts in modern WoW history. Method would ultimately claim world first on Mythic Kill Jaden after hundreds and hundreds of wipes on the last 2 bosses combined. What made their composition interesting was the number of rogues rogues that they brought, and you know, for the first time ever, it's not primarily always about the damage. This raid was nicknamed by the community Tomb of Soakgarus, soaking just being an ability the boss does that you have to send multiple people to stand in, and here rogues excelled time and again. For Fallen Avatar, the penultimate boss, Method brought 5 rogues to their 25-man mythic raid. But why rogues here again? Well, as mentioned, the answer is both damage and survivability. Here for rogues, they would first of all have Cloak of Shadows, an ability that would make them immune to magic damage for its duration. And using Cloak, rogues could quite easily just stand in stuff that other classes would straight up need immunities to live through, or at least external cooldowns. On Kil'jaeden, rogues continue to be valuable for similar reasons, most importantly with again Cloak of Shadows and Feint. Now Feint is really what deserves a special mention here, because honestly it had been in a crazy overpowered state for literally years at this point in time. It would reduce area of effect damage by a huge amount and could be used constantly, meaning rogues were just standing in stuff which would have outright killed other classes no problem. This wasn't just a thing specific to Legion. Rogues have been trivializing mechanics with Feint for literally expansions in a row. Blizzard just never got around to changing it because I guess this was just an area where rogues were expected to excel. Method raid leader Scripe said in interviews after their kill that rogues were simply too strong in Tomb of Sargeras. He joked that they considered gearing up 5 rogues initially but thought that 4 must be enough, and when you combine their survivability with their good overall damage, rogues were the complete package for a raid tier where survivability on Mythic was just as important as damage. What makes this example different from other ones is that it wasn't about finding a broken damage interaction. It was about recognizing a class's defensive toolkit was so good that it could deal with mechanics that other classes just couldn't. Method used rogues to turn what should have been a raid wiping ability into something that 1 or 2 players could handle. Blizzard would go on in later expansions to modify rogue survivability, and I think these last 2 bosses in Fallen Avatar and Mythic Kil'jaeden were a big reason why. Next we're going back to one of the most infamous examples of class stacking in WoW's history, and it comes from the very beginning of the Cataclysm expansion. In early 2011, the Finnish guild Paragon achieved the world first kill of heroic Nefarian in Blackwing Descent, and when they posted their kill screenshots and videos, people noticed something a little bit strange. They had 11 druids in the raid, 11 out of their 25 members that was. The reason for this extreme class stacking came down to a specific mechanic and how it interacted with feral druid bleeds on Nefarian. Throughout the Nefarian encounter on Heroic, players would be randomly mind controlled by an ability called Dominion. Whilst you were mind controlled, you would gradually walk towards a portal, and here you had 2 choices. You could break the mind control and be free and go in DPS, or you could spam an ability of Siphon Power to build stacks of a buff called Stolen Power. Stolen Power increased your damage and healing by 3% per stack, up to a maximum of 150 stacks. That's a potential of 450% extra damage. For most classes, this buff will be consumed in a few abilities, so you get a few massive hits and then the buff will be gone. But for feral druids, they had a different experience. This was because a lot of their abilities came through their bleed damage over time effects, and when you cast Rip with Stolen Power when the boss was below 25% health, you could then Ferocious Bite and benefit from a talent that would automatically refresh the duration of your Rip, essentially making it so you could carry this absolutely insane dot for the remainder of the fight. But even beyond that, if a feral druid just got mind controlled at any point in time, they'd be able to contribute an enormous amount of damage on the boss. Paragon brought 11 druids to their kill, with the majority of them being feral DPS. This wasn't technically a bug or an exploit either. Stolen Power was working how it was expected to work, and so were feral druids. Blizzard just hadn't anticipated that a damage over time effect would benefit so dramatically from this buff. There was a bit of back and forth after Paragon's kill about them class stacking like this, but at the end of the day, they're a guild going for the race to world first. If you want to be the best, sometimes you have to come up with unique strategies, and sometimes those unique strategies involve filling your raid with cats. Paragon themselves defended the strategy, noting that 11 druids were possible because at the end of the day, druids could still fill every single role in the raid. It's not like they were running 11 feral druids for the entire tier. It was just for this one encounter. Nevertheless though, this is one of the more memorable instances of class stacking during a race to world first. At number 2 we go to the Crucible of Storms in Battle for Azeroth. This was a short 2-boss raid that ended up being way more difficult than anyone expected. The European Guild pieces claimed the world first kill by downing Mythic Unat, and their raid composition was absolutely crazy, using 14 ranged DPS, 5 of those being Elemental Shaman, 4 of them Warlocks, and only 1 melee DPS, which was a Demon Hunter who, at least back then, put up a debuff that made enemies take more magic damage. The fight heavily rewarded being able to attack from range, where you have more space to deal with mechanics. Elemental Shaman specifically here brought incredible value beyond their damage. They had reincarnation, giving the raid an extra battle resurrection to recover from mistakes, or indeed deliberately have shamans die to certain mechanics so they didn't have to be dealt with, and then just have them reincarnate and carry on. Warlocks provided their own unique advantages too, such as Demonic Gateway to help out the raid reposition, and they had strong sustained damage, execute, and AoE damage too. Pieces took over 700 pulls to kill Unat in total. That is the single largest pull count of any end boss in World of Warcraft's history, and it absolutely goes down as one of the most difficult fights ever. In interviews after their kill, Pieces explained their choice to stack Elemental Shamans over bringing more Warlocks. They noted whilst Warlock's mobility was good, being able to teleport around the encounter, the damage they were taking was fairly healable, whereas Shaman brought extra reincarnations that was key to their strategy. What makes this example notable is how extreme the class restriction was. It's one thing to say you want to bring more range than melee, or to bring a few of one more so than the other. It's another thing to entirely bring a singular melee who is there just for a debuff. If Demon Hunters didn't have that magic debuff, I'm sure they wouldn't have been there, and Pieces would have brought along more Warlock or Shaman. But for Mythic Unat, this is what the fight demanded, and Pieces had the raid comp to make it work. For the number 1 spot, we're going to Warlords of Draenor's final patch and the Hellfire Citadel raid. Whilst this wasn't race to world first or even a particularly difficult boss, this was perhaps the best example of ridiculous class stacking this game has ever seen. The second boss became a bit of a meme for one thing, and that was Arcane Mages absolutely destroying it in a matter of seconds. The setup for this required several different things to come together. First was a new talent in Warlords called Prismatic Crystal. You place a crystal down on the ground, and it would replicate a bonus 30% of your damage dealt to it to nearby targets. This was already overpowered, but it gets better. Second was a trinket from Hellfire Citadel called Prophecy of Fear. This trinket made your direct damaging abilities trigger an additional burst of AoE damage. Most classes could proc this every few seconds. Arcane Mages, however, could proc it constantly thanks to arcane missiles. On top of that, there was something else in Warlords of Draenor called Multi-Strike. This gave your attacks a chance to hit 2 additional times at 30% of their original damage. When you combined all of these factors with fully geared Arcane Mages popping their cooldowns, the result was absolutely crazy. And guilds would realize that you could just stack Arcane Mages and absolutely blow up bosses in Hellfire Citadel, and this is when this was still current content. On Mythic mode, by the way, there was a group that ran 17 Arcane Mages. That's 17 out of your 20 raid spots, and if you look at Warcraft logs data from Hellfire Citadel Mythic, particularly on Iron Reaver, Arcane Mages were absolutely crushing every single other spec in the game. The gap between them and second place looked like vanilla levels of warrior dominance. Then again, this was right at the end of the expansion, and this strategy didn't exactly work on every single boss either. And shortly after, the pre-patch for Legion would come around and things would all be shaken up significantly. But for a moment here, Arcane Mages were able to do something truly ridiculous. Class stacking, when you think back to it, really has been a part of World of Warcraft for as long as the game has existed. Sometimes it's subtle, bringing an extra shaman for more bloodlust. Sometimes it's a bit more extreme, like when you're running 11 feral druids, 14 ranged DPS, or maybe even 23 warriors. But often it's guilds pushing the absolute limits, racing for world first, going for speed clears, and so on. These moments show both the brilliance and sometimes the flaws of WoW's class design. On one hand, it's amazing to see players discover interactions and strategies that the developers never foresaw. On the other, it can feel bad when your class is not the meta pick and you're watching somebody else who's just rolled an ult to do double your damage. And class stacking is something that Blizzard constantly has to deal with each new raid tier as well, because inevitably there's often just one class or spec which is just amazing at dealing with certain scenarios. There's a specific type of World of Warcraft player who looks at the game and doesn't just ask how to play it well, they ask how far they can push every single system before something breaks. And across the many years of classic content we've now had between Vanilla and Wrath, those players have come up with some genuinely unhinged discoveries. Some of these were harmless fun or things which Blizzard ignored that you can still do today, and others completely broke the game in absolutely unintended ways. And when you hear about some of the techniques people used, you will wonder how people even came across them. But the journey to get the highest DPS or the fastest run through a raid never ends, despite it being difficult or easy. So these are 10 of the most degenerate min-max methods we've seen in classic World of Warcraft so far. And number 10 is something which is very creative but has to come low down on the list just because it's so well known, and that is the Alliance faction being able to pick up the Warchief's Blessing buff. So Warchief's Blessing is a Horde world buff, and it's always been that way. The clue is very much in the name. When a Horde player completes the quest for the Horde, they turn in Rend Blackhand's head inside of Orgrimmar, and about 6 seconds later a buff will drop for everyone inside of Orgrimmar and the crossroads called Warchief's Blessing, giving them a bunch of health, mana per 5, and most importantly 15% melee haste, and that's what really matters here. Of course, with vanilla content, warriors have always been the best damage dealers, so anything that makes your warriors do more damage is super important. However, this is a Horde only buff, there's no question about that really, and yet Alliance players figured out if they got mind controlled as the buff would drop, during that mind control their faction would temporarily change from Alliance over to the Horde, allowing them to effectively get this buff. So people who wanted to min-max absolutely wanted Warchief's Blessing. It is one of the most powerful world buffs out there, so Alliance players would travel deep into Horde territory, often finding safe spots inside of Orgrimmar or outside in the crossroads, and wait until the buff would drop. After that, they'd either have to be mind controlled by a Horde priest, or have somebody on the Horde use a gnomish mind control cap on them, which would temporarily change their faction and allow them to pick up the buff. Now usually with this quest there is a 3-hour cooldown after you hand it in before you can get the buff to go out again, but with layers on our mega servers now it's become much easier to pick up the buff. Did you know that during Season of Discovery, Blizzard finally created an Alliance equivalent of this called the Might of Stormwind, so that players didn't have to mess about with any of this? And Classic Era briefly had this buff as well, but enough people complained that it was changing the meta of the game that Blizzard ended up removing it again, because apparently enough people prefer going to Horde territory and getting mind controlled instead, so I guess each to their own. Blizzard patched out you swapping faction when you're mind controlled right at the start of TBC, so any future interactions like this would no longer exist. But to this day, if you're really trying to min-max on Classic Era, or Vanilla in general for that matter, you'll be venturing into Horde territory to pick up your Warchief's Blessing. And number 9 is a method of min-maxing which doesn't even involve starting the raid whatsoever, and that's fishing for a good ID inside of AQ40. So if you've ever done AQ40, I'm sure you will know the nightmare that is the trash between Twin Emperors and Cthulhu. It is widely considered the worst part of the raid by a huge margin. In fact, if Blizzard just lowered the amount of trash in this corridor, I think people would treat AQ40 a lot more kindly. But as we know, the raid, it's always been a nightmare. Among the trash in there are roaming packs of enemies with Karaji Slayers and Karaji Mind Slayers, and the distinction between these two matters a lot. The Slayers are melee enemies which are relatively straightforward, they deal a bunch of AoE damage, which is very much manageable. The Mind Slayers, however, are a big problem within the raid. They do two things which really harm the speed of your raid. Number 1 is mind controlling random players. Obviously, if you have 20 something warriors in a raid, which speedrun guilds very much will do, then if one of them gets mind controlled and the other warriors are all spamming cleave and whirlwind, they're going to pretty much one-shot them, so that's absolutely no good. Secondly is when mind slayers die, they trigger a mana burn effect which also has a horrify tied onto it that will fear all nearby targets. You don't always have an ability ready to deal with this, and it just slows you down either way. However, the amount of slayers and mind slayers that spawn per ID is random, and speedrunning guilds figured out that they could effectively roll for a good ID before even engaging within the raid. The method was having priests cast mind vision throughout the instance, hopping from boss to scout out Cthulhu's corridor. Once they were there, a weak aura would figure out how many mind slayers were in that particular ID, and if it was way too many, you would simply zone out, reset the raid, zone in again, and hop back to those trash packs via mind vision again. And you can repeat this as many times as you want. So if you're a priest, you're bored, or you're trying to set up for a speedrun, you could spend hours and hours looking for a good ID, and when you finally find one, you just wait inside the instance for the raid time to start. And number 8 is one of the most weird yet technically beneficial consumables in the game, the Humble Boggling Route. This one requires you to go all the way back to the Night Elf starting zone in Teldrassil and complete a very specific quest line. You work through Denelyn's tasks in Dolinar, eventually triggering the Glowing Fruit quest, and when you turn that in, 3 Bogglings will spawn next to his box. You kill those Bogglings, collect the roots, and you're done. Those are the only roots that you can get on that particular character. Unless that is somebody else spawns the Bogglings, you steal the tag and loot them instead, which I'm sure happens occasionally. And what do boggling roots do? They give you 1 bonus physical damage for 10 minutes. Not 1% or any form of multiplier, just 1 bonus damage. At a first glance, this seems just like some random flavor item from a starting zone. Vanilla's full of stuff like this after all. However, this buff stacks with other similar effects, and as we've already gone over, melee classes in vanilla are pretty good, so anything that does make you do more damage is beneficial. So if you're really going all out, then you can go and farm boggling roots, but you'll either have to do it on a new character each time and farm them up, or maybe go and borrow some other people's tags. It's not like they're going to use them too much anyway, is it? And number 7 is what people call the Green Mana Potion. Flask of Distilled Wisdom was primarily used by healers during vanilla World of Warcraft. The reason is that Flask of Supreme Power only gives spell damage, and spell damage and healing power are different stats in vanilla, so really you do have to use this one if you want to pop a flask. What people found though is it didn't just increase your maximum mana by 2000. If you were below that threshold, say at 100 mana, and you drank a Distilled Wisdom, it would set your current mana to 2000. You can probably see where this is going, and this is why people called it the Green Mana Potion, because if you're in a speedrun, you're going as fast as possible, you're constantly healing or dropping totems or whatever it may be, you just don't have time to sit down and drink as much as you would want to. So what do you do other than just chain pop flasks of Distilled Wisdom to keep your mana bar going and your melee group alive? This was particularly useful on the Horde because they were more reliant on their mana whilst healing. You see, on the Alliance side, Alliance have Paladins, and Paladins have incredibly good mana efficiency because whenever their heals crit, they gain 100% of the mana back, and that obviously stacks super well with world buffs. Horde Shamans do not have anywhere near as good mana management, so there have been speedruns on the Horde side of the game where players are popping literally dozens of flasks in a single raid just to keep up. It's extremely expensive and not something you do every week, but if you're really trying to min-max, then this is a great example of it. And number 6 is perhaps one of the shortest lived min-maxes we've ever seen in this game, the 48-hour Fire Warrior during Wrath of the Lich King Classic. Surprisingly, there was a decent amount of new min-maxes that came out during Wrath. You'd think all the weird and degenerate stuff would happen in vanilla, so this was a bit of a surprise to me at least. However, when Wrath of the Lich King came out, one of the underlying mechanical changes was that critical strike rating was turned into a unified stat. Previously, you had melee crit and you had spell crit as 2 separate things, and when it was combined, some unintended consequences arose from it, and one of those gave birth to the Fire Warrior. So what is that? Well, Deep Wounds is an Arms Warrior talent that causes your critical strikes to apply a bleed effect, dealing a portion of your weapon's damage. And in a world where crit is crit and there's no difference between spell crit and melee crit, well, this Deep Wounds effect was proccing from spell effects. However, warriors don't have spell effects, do they? Unless they started to equip random things which did do spell damage, such as using the Fiery Weapon enchant from vanilla, or using Fiery Plate Gauntlets that had an on-hit effect that dealt some bonus fire damage. Suddenly, warriors were fishing through all these old random spell damage based procs from vanilla and seeing how many of them they could stack up on their items, because that deep wounds proc was doing a really good amount of their damage, and this wasn't a massive DPS gain either, and warriors were absolutely sitting towards the bottom of the DPS meters at the start of Wrath. They really were bad then. However, when Blizzard caught wind of this, they patched it pretty much immediately, and they said in the notes, deep wounds no longer triggers from non-physical damage, such as the fiery weapon enchant, because as much as it was a funny way to min-max, it was also highly unintuitive to go and equip random spell power procs from vanilla, so I think I can see why they changed this fairly fast. And number 5 is Feral Druids and how they interacted with the weak Troll's Blood potion. You just don't get a list about doing weird min-max stuff without having additions from the Feral Druid on it, and this one does require some extra context about what Blizzard did to Feral Druids in TBC Classic. So the core of Feral DPS was power shifting. In vanilla, energy ticked on a constant server-side timer that ran continuously, regardless of what form you were in. So if you shifted out of cat form and back into it right before the tick, you would gain 20 energy from the tick, 20 from Wolf's Head Helm, and 20 from your Fiora talent, allowing you to cast way more shreds in your rotation compared to just sitting in cat form. Now in original Burning Crusade and patch 2.2, Blizzard changed how power regeneration worked across the whole game. Each player would now maintain their own personal regeneration tick timer, and any change to your personal regeneration rate would reset it, and it would grant an immediate partial refund of energy based upon your old rate, and then start the fresh ticks at the new rate about 2 seconds later. This was designed to improve abilities such as Evocation or Innovate, where if you started them on a bad tick, they would just lose a tick out of their entire duration. However, for Feral Druids, it quietly destroyed the power shifting playstyle, because entering cat form was a regeneration event that reset the tick timer, meaning you change into cat form, not get the energy tick when you should have, and have to sit there waiting for the next event to happen. The rotation was pretty much completely destroyed. Here's where the weak Troll's Blood potion comes in. Some Feral Druids figured out that any change to any form of regeneration reset your personal tick timer. Now, weak Troll's Blood potion is a super low level consumable that provides a tiny amount of health regeneration, but if you drank this consumable before you entered cat form during a power shift and then cancelled it when you were in cat form, this would count as resetting your personal tick timer, allowing you to always get that energy tick whilst you're in cat form, as you would have been able to under the old energy system. So the macro was consume potion, power shift, cancel buff. This meant you'd be consuming and then cancelling a weak Troll's Blood potion every couple of seconds to maintain the correct tick timer for your energy window. On a 3-minute fight, you go through about 40 weak Troll's Blood potions. Blizzard eventually brought the energy tick behavior back to the constant 2-second loop that vanilla used, making this whole Troll's Blood energy potions thing unnecessary. But for that brief window before the fix, Feral Druids were doing something monumentally degenerate. And that is not all about Feral Druid, because in Wrath of the Lich King, they came up with something entirely new, and that is bear weaving. So Feral by Wrath standard was considered one of the more complicated rotations in the game. You're tracking your dots, you're managing your energy, you've got Savage Roar, and you've got all your combo points to deal with too. But some players took it even further with a technique called bear weaving. One thing you should also know about Wrath of the Lich King is that Blizzard changed how energy regeneration worked, so your typical power shifting just wasn't a thing anymore. In vanilla and TBC, it was 20 energy every 2 ticks, and power shifting was very much built around this. In Wrath and Beyond, energy will be constantly regenerated at a much more smoother rate rather than you getting it in big chunks. So this led to scenarios where in cat form you had downtime. So what did people do? They shifted into bear form and started using abilities in that form instead, primarily stacking up Lacerate and using Mangle. After you've got your Lacerate stacks up and you use Mangle, you go back into cat form, the Fiora talent gives you a burst of energy, and then you're doing cat things such as Shred, maintaining dots, Savage Roar, and so on. And then you're going back into bear to maintain those dots as well. And that's why it's called bear weaving. On top of that, there was something else Feral Druids were doing in Wrath as well, and that was spamming Gift of the Wild during downtime or during the pre-pull. The reason was that Gift of the Wild in Wrath would go on every single player in your raid, and it could proc Omen of Clarity, which would make your next ability free. And because Gift of the Wild was going on your whole raid, the chance for it to proc Omen was extremely high. So again, during periods of downtime, people would just pop out of cat form and cast Gift of the Wild on their raid to try and get a free shred. And that was on top of bear weaving as well, by the way. The result was feral druids were doing marginally more damage than they would have otherwise. However, Blizzard came along and gave them a significant buff. This happened sometime during Ulduar. They said Omen of Clarity will now always trigger when Fairy Fire Feral is used on a non-player, non-pet target. At the same time, Omen of Clarity will no longer proc from Gift of the Wild. This change is intended to smooth out feral DPS gameplay for most players and resolve many of the social and gameplay challenges that were created by the so-called bear weaving combat strategy. In many situations, bear weaving not only increases the mechanical complexity of a class to a degree that was far above what was intended, but it also places strain on the raid to keep up with the druid's additional threat generation. This guaranteed Omen of Clarity ended up being a significant buff for feral druids, which made them arguably even stronger than they should have been by later raids in Wrath of the Lich King. In fact, during the start of ICC, Blizzard were considering removing this buff, but I believe feral druids managed to convince Blizzard to hold off doing this, and so cats with their very sharp claws in some cases ended up out DPSing people with Shadowmourne. Feral druids were definitely one of the biggest winners of Wrath of the Lich King after this change, I can tell you that. And number 3 was staying in Wrath of the Lich King for a rather ingenious way that rogues min-max their AoE damage. So the brand new AoE ability for rogues in Wrath was Fan of Knives. This hit nearby enemies with both your weapons for 70% weapon damage, or if you were wielding 2 daggers, 105% weapon damage. And this was just something you could spam on trash, didn't generate combo points back then on your primary target, and would just let you keep up to some extent on AoE. However, rogue players found a combination of weapons and talents which let them be the best AoE DPS in the game, which no one expected. So first of all, you were playing at least some variation of Assassination Rogue. A really important talent was Focused Attacks. This made it so every time you dealt a critical strike, you gained 2 energy back. And then we have to look at the daggers they were using. The first and the most important one was Fell Striker. This is of course a dagger that drops from the Ren Blackhan event in UBRS, and has absolutely no relevant stats for a level 80 character, aside from the proc, which was a chance on hit to make all attacks to be guaranteed critical strikes for 3 seconds, and it was around a 4% proc rate. Against a single target, 4% proc rate, not very good, but when you're hitting 20 targets with both your weapons using Fan of Knives, it was pretty much guaranteed to proc instantly. This meant rogues using Fan could always crit, and when they were always critting, their focused attack was giving them 2 energy per crit. So using just these 2 things, Fan of Knives was paying for itself, and it was just infinitely spammable on enough enemies. However, you also needed a main hand weapon to go with this, and what people initially used was Titan Steel Spellblade. This was a main hand that was designed for casters, as you would expect from the name, and was ordinarily never going to be used by a rogue. However, it was the slowest main-handed dagger at the start of Wrath of the Lich King, which meant it had the highest weapon damage that would scale with Fan of Knives 105% multiplier. It was just funny though, because on trash packs, your ideal pair of weapons were a main hand that spellcasters were supposed to use, and a dagger from a level 60 dungeon. This was always working as intended from a mechanical standpoint though, nothing was bugged here, and Blizzard never changed it. And number 2 is how engineering was used in TBC for speedruns, and this one is absolutely crazy. So Ultra Safe Transporter Toshley Station, or the Goblin version, are engineering items crafted during TBC, which will take you to different places in Outland. Now when you use this Ultra Safe Teleporter, one of the outcome is that it will change your character's model for 1 hour. One of those possible outcomes is making your model into that of a Tauren. Now of course, Tauren, having the largest model in the game, actually have slightly higher attack ranges than other races, meaning for a melee class they would usually be good, but they lose out because their other racials aren't as good as other choices. However, this engineering item has a 4-hour cooldown, so really it would be highly impractical to try and get this debuff on your entire raid before a speedrun happened. That was until someone found out about a rather creative way you could use this engineering item. It turned out if you Alt F4'd out of your game with half a second left on the cast of this item, you would get one of the potential debuff outcomes without it actually going on cooldown. So players who were looking to speedrun would spam this item, Alt F4 out the game, log back in, see what debuff they've got, and repeat it until they have the ones that they're looking for. And this didn't stop at the Tauren model either, because the debuffs have multiple outcomes and they all stacked with one another. There were 2 others which minorly increased your character size too, such as the Soul Split Good and Evil transformations, and top guilds who wanted every advantage would aim for the Tauren, the Soul Split Evil, and the Soul Split Good debuffs. And this wasn't about just attacking a little bit sooner because of the extra model size. On the Felmist encounter, you could actually attack her while she was in the air if you stacked your entire raid on top of a cart and jumped up and down with all these character size improvements. And if you ever go back and watch some speedruns, you'll see their entire melee stack are these absolutely enormous Taurens swinging away with glaives, which is just hilarious to see. And as far as I know, I don't believe Blizzard ever even changed this either. And at number 1 is the Blade of Eternal Darkness Blackwing Lair pre-clear bug. So Blade of Eternal Darkness is an epic dagger that drops from Maridon from Princess Theradras. It has a chance on hit to deal some shadow damage and restore 100 mana with a pretty low proc rate. This is usually used by mages AoE farming because every instance of Blizzard can proc the on-hit effect, meaning essentially if you're pulling enough stuff you never go boom, which is obviously very good. However, it was used in an entirely different way in Blackwing Lair, and the class that made the most out of it were in fact priests through Mind Vision. So Mind Vision, as I'm sure you'll know, is not a damaging spell, it just lets you see through an enemy or an ally's eyes, and priests discovered that using Mind Vision on an enemy had a chance to proc the Blade of Eternal Darkness, dealing 100 damage to them. And of course, when the enemy took damage, they would enter combat and then start pathing towards the thing that had dealt damage to them. So for example, when you're in Blackwing Lair and you're doing the Razorgore encounter, you have a lot of downtime whilst you have that one guy destroying all the eggs. So what better use of that downtime than to spam vision on trash packs later in the raid, fishing for Blade of Eternal Darkness procs, so they would come running around down to the raid. And yes, these trash packs would run up from the room above Veilstraz, down the ramp, and through the gate into the Razorgore encounter, allowing people to clear out all this trash whilst just doing Razorgore as they normally would. This was obviously a significant time save as it was making the trash clearing massively more efficient. Later still, players also discovered another scouting application for Priest Mind Vision inside of Blackwing Lair. This was very similar to what happened in AQ40 with people scouting how many Mind Slayers there were in an ID. You could Mind Vision all the way to the end of the instance and see which brood power the Worm Guards had. The absolute worst brood power is the bronze one. This is the one that makes the tank spin around and deal massive damage to everyone nearby. So you could zone in and out and fish for an ID with no bronze powers, which would make this section of the raid significantly easier. Though I believe in some later speedruns, people just invisibility potion past pretty much all the brood guards, making this section of the raid trivial anyway. I believe it was the Horde Guild Calamity that first did the Mind Vision Blade of Eternal Darkness pre-clear, and I think that has to be one of the more clever ways people have min-maxed their way through a raid. And there we have it, what for me are 10 of the most degenerate and strange min-maxes we've ever seen in Classic's history so far. You never know though, people are always cooking up new things and trying to fish out new ways to make the raid a little bit faster. So despite the game being so old, there's always room for discovery. Mounts in World of Warcraft started off as themselves being a milestone that we all work towards. Everyone who began at level 1 would have to undergo a massive amount of leveling before you would finally hit level 40 and learn your riding skill, as well as buying your first mount. Or in reality, you get level 40, think nice I can buy my mount, realise you have no gold, and then you'd end up buying it at level 46 or something. But still, over time the level at which you've got your first mount has changed around so much. There have been epic mounts, flying mounts, dragon riding, and so much more. What it takes for a mount to really stand out in this game has become more and more difficult to achieve. Yet some mounts to this day are incredibly rare within modern World of Warcraft. They represent times gone by for some players, or a moment when you were able to earn something through limited time events. Today I want to go over what are 10 of the rarest, no longer obtainable mounts in World of Warcraft. These will range from mounts that you may have on your account if you play long enough, to mounts which I can more or less guarantee not only you don't own, but you've probably never even seen them. These have to be the 10 rarest mounts in World of Warcraft. First up at number 10 is the Frostbrood Proto-Worm. Whilst this mount was available for a shorter period of time than many others on this list, it was also released much more recently, so people have become a bit more accustomed to the idea of collection, and it was also locked behind a pretty pretty easy task, meaning a decent number of players will have had time to ensure they've collected this mount whilst it was available. The Frostbrew Proto Worm was a promo for Wrath of the Lich King Classic that was available for about 3 months between September and November of 2022, and to get it you simply had to complete the Death Knight starter zone on either Horde or Alliance, and then you'd get this mount on retail. The idea here was to try and get players of modern World of Warcraft over to Classic to try the original Death Knight, and to see if some of them would get interested and stick around to try the expansion for a bit longer. This mount was a big hook to get people on board, as it had the kind of details you'd typically see from either something on the store or at least the trading post. After Wrath Classic officially released, this mount was made unobtainable, and there hasn't been a way to get it since, though unlike some of the other mounts I'll talk about today, I could see Blizzard possibly adding this back into the game one day in some way or another. Next is one of the earliest mounts to be made discontinued on this list, and that is the Amani Warbear. Chances are if you played TBC Classic, you now have this mount in your collection. I mean, I feel like everyone who played the patch where Zul'Aman dropped even a little bit ended up getting this bear. At the time when the Amani Warbear dropped too, bear type mounts were super rare within the game, so to have earned this made you really stand out amongst the crowd. To obtain it was, well, fairly straightforward. You just had to have defeated all the animal-themed bosses in Zul'Aman within a 25-minute time frame. So at the start of the dungeon, you'd begin with 15 minutes, and then the first and second bosses would add a further 5 minutes each to the timer. If you were able to do this, a prisoner that was due to be sacrificed would give you a bag that would contain the mount guaranteed, meaning if you were doing this place daily, you'd get this mount pretty quickly, especially if you're running with guildies. Of course, back in the day, this was seen as much more of a speed run, and the rarity of the mount in retail speaks to how much more of a challenge this was seen as being at the time. Jeff Kaplan had some words about the removal of this mount in fact. He says once Wrath goes live, you'll no longer be able to obtain the Zul'Aman bear mount by saving all 4 prisoners in the timed run. To be clear, the Zul'Aman bear mount is supposed to be an item of very high prestige, and we want players who have earned it during the appropriate era to be recognised for their accomplishment. Later, still in Cataclysm, when Blizzard brought back Zul'Aman and ZG as 5-player dungeons, they re-added in a bear mount for saving prisoners, calling it the Amani Battle Bear, as a bit of a throwback to the original, though let's be real, the Warbear has always looked way cooler. Next I want to talk about a bunch of mounts actually, all of those that can be obtained as an ahead of the curve achievement reward. Traditionally in World of Warcraft now, defeating a final boss of an expansion since Mists of Pandaria on either Heroic or Mythic has earned you a unique mount to show off. So far those are the Kor'kron Warwolf from Garrosh Hellscream in Mists of Pandaria, the Grove Warden from Archimonde in Warlords of Draenor, the Violet Spellwing from Argus in Legion, the Uncorrupted Voidwing from the Zoth in BFA, and most recently the Carcinized Zeref Steed from the Jailer in Shadowlands. In Dragonflight they had a dragon riding customization to resemble Fyrakk as a mount, instead of him himself actually just giving you some kind of mount. So I guess this kind of counts as well. Either way, the nature of ahead of the curve requires you to defeat what is a reasonably difficult boss on at least a heroic difficulty level, meaning this can be quite challenging to do, especially if you're not actively raiding within a guild, though since you do have the entire patch to defeat the boss, by the end of it with all the power creep in the game and potential nerf, things do tend to become much easier, or you can just get boosted as well to be fair, can't you? Still, whether you just have 1 or 2 of these or all of them, I think they definitely count as some of the rarer mounts in the game. So I think with those first 3 there is a pretty good chance that you've managed to get at least some of them. From here on out, things are going to start to get a lot more challenging. Well, at least in terms of having these mounts on modern World of Warcraft. On Classic, there's a pretty good chance you have them, but that's its whole own different thing. At number 7 though is the Reigns of the Black Proto-Drake. This was awarded through the meta achievement Glory of the Raider 25 in Wrath of the Lich King. As achievements were first rolled out in Wrath, this was the first set of meta achievements to award a mount, though I believe we didn't know at the time that the mount would be removed and that it was a limited time thing. The achievement in question involved you completing max 25 whilst meeting a bunch of different requirements, such as how many players you brought, defeating bosses within a certain time frame and so on. And whilst Nax and tier 7 for that matter were infamously face roll, as well as this mount being available for about 5 months, it's still pretty rare within the game. Also, this isn't to be confused with the Reigns of the Plagued Proto-Drake either. This was awarded from the Glory of the Raider 10-man achievement. However, this was re-added into the game via the Black Market Auction House during Mists of Pandaria, whereas the Black Drake wasn't. Also, this was one of the very few 310% speed flying mounts in the game at this time. Up to Wrath, the only way to get this speed on a flying mount previously was a rank 1 PvP mount or Ashes of Allah, so this speaks to the prestige that Blizzard and the players would have associated with this mount back in the day. In fact, you couldn't even train 310% flying speed until Cataclysm, but the Black Proto Drake is still a rare sight in retail, despite it being seen as one of the easier meta achievement mounts from original World of Warcraft. Next up, we're heading into Trial of the Grand Crusader for some more unavailable mounts. First is a set of mounts that could be earned from completing a tribute to Insanity 10 player. This involved completing Trial of the Grand Crusader on 10 player without having white. This awarded the Swift Alliance Steed or the Swift Horde Wolf, depending on your faction. Trial of the Grand Crusader was the raid where they pushed the most rewards possible with the whole attempt system intact. In fact, you had 50 attempts per week on heroic mode back then, so if you wiped 50 times, that was it. The bosses despawn and you just had to come back next week and try again. Trial of the Grand Crusader was also the first raid to take on the heroic mode difficulty that had been used in dungeons since TBC. Whilst Ulduar before it had hard mode that could be activated on some bosses by taking certain actions, heroic was simply a difficulty you set the raid to before entering, and really it works the same way as it does today. Also back in the day during original Wrath, no lockouts were shared between Trial of the Crusader 10 and 25 and Trial of the Grand Crusader 10 and 25, so you could do this raid 4 times per reset if you wanted to, and the gear was a big step up from Ulduar. Remember, Blizzard actually buffed loads of the gear in Ulduar to make it more competitive during Wrath Classic, so a lot of people really spammed this raid back in the day. I bet many successful 25 player guilds downscaled to farm 10 for some items and to grab the achievements and their rewards as well. In Wrath Classic, Blizzard also made 10 and 25 share lockouts across different difficulties amidst concerns that players would burn them out spamming this raid on all difficulties, as people had the tendency to do back in the day, which for our modern gaming crowd was probably the right call. So in Wrath Classic, if you were committed to a 25 player guild, you'd have had to have foregone a week of loot to try at this achievement. I did Trial of the Grand Crusader every single reset, and I am really not sure if I ever did a single 10-man, to be honest. It's just kind of awkward to downscale from 25 to 10 really. Overall though, these pair of mounts remain one of the rarest sets in World of Warcraft, but there was something that was even more difficult to get from Trial of the Grand Crusader, and that was from the achievement A Tribute to Immortality. This not only involved completing a run of Trial of the Grand Crusader 25 with no wipes, but also with no deaths in the raid at all. This awarded either the Crusaders white or black warhorse depending on your faction, and to be honest, even in Wrath Classic, this was still not easy to obtain. Yes, in theory all the bosses are very easy by today's standards, but any mistake means it's over for the entire raid, and you can't just reset either. It's one attempt at this per week. So if you have this mount from back in the day, this means you were in a serious raiding guild. Unlike some other mounts too, such as the Head of the Curve ones, you couldn't even boost to get this mount either because of the 0 death stipulation of the achievement. If someone's getting boosted, they're gonna stand somewhere stupid and die at some point. The final boss, Anubarak, was always a tense moment too during his final phase, as he would drain a large percentage of your maximum health every second, meaning you were intended to basically have the entire raid on next to no health all of the time, and healers had to carefully manage health bars to ensure that they didn't go boom and that nobody died. Honestly, this is one of the harder achievements to have a mount reward ever in World of Warcraft, even by today's standards. Believe me, it's just so easy for one thing to go wrong when you get one try per week with 25 people in a raid. At the number 4 spot are a set of mounts which, if you saw them in game, you probably wouldn't give them a second look. You just think, oh, it's some low-level player on a very standard-looking starter mount. But in reality, these are some of the rarest mounts in the game, and these are all of the original epic mounts within World of Warcraft. They rode at 100% speed, but they didn't have armor, as the epic mounts that came later did. These were obtainable during vanilla from launch up to patch 1.4. After 1.4, Blizzard added updated mount models into the game, the same ones that exist today, and offered you the chance to trade in your old epic mount mount for a new one. Some players, however, had grown attached to their first epic mount, and even though the updated ones definitely had more flair to them, they kept on to their original mount, which many years later turned out to be a decision that a lot more people would have made if they knew the rarity these mounts would have. These mounts have also never existed in our classic timeline either. Blizzard were asked about adding them before release, and they said they didn't want to add them into the game, as players may have felt pressured to level fast and to earn tons of gold to buy them before they would have been discontinued in accordance with when this would have happened originally. I mean, they could have just added them in and left them there, but things were very no changes back then, so Blizzard were doing right by the community with this attitude. These mounts are the only ones that didn't return to the game with Classic, so if you still have one today on retail, they should always retain their rarity, which is pretty cool. On to the top 3 now for mounts, and these are the ones which are super rare. First is the Black Kiraji Resonating Crystal used to summon the Black Battle Tank mount. The undertaking to earn this mount was a truly legendary feat, and as you may well know, was tied to the opening of the Gates of AQ during vanilla World of Warcraft. The rarity of this mount in modern WoW really has several factors. Only a handful of players per realm would realistically be able to achieve this mount in the limited time frame when it was available. This was because a massive quest chain to obtain the Scepter of the Shifting Sands had to be completed, alongside the war effort too, which involved turning in literally millions of items between each faction. After both of these steps had been completed, any player with the Scepter could sound the gong outside of AQ, starting the 10-hour war. Any other player with a Scepter also had to turn the quest in during this time frame, otherwise they would have missed their window and would be unable to get the mount. The server-wide effort that went into this was, without exaggeration, still probably the most ambitious event Blizzard has ever held within the game, and taking part in this and going for the mount would have been your entire life for several weeks in a row. Due to one player being able to bang the gong to start the event, the limited time nature of it, and the server-wide collaboration, it's not hard to picture why so few players earned this mount back in the day. Now during Classic, it's quite a different story of course. Whilst it was still as ever a monumental effort, you bet that a lot more people this time around wanted to earn themselves that Scarab Lord title and mount. As such, people would collude between factions to ensure that designated players had farmed their scepters and were ready to turn the quest in prior to the war effort completing. As far as I know, the Russian server Flamegore counted the largest number of Scarab Lords with 90 in total. This would have been totally unimaginable back in the original vanilla. Still, with so many more people earning this title amount, it really isn't all that common in Classic, and much less so in retail. But wait, there is more. Did you know at the start of Wrath of the Lich King, Blizzard released a new set of realms for World of Warcraft due to the growth of the game. These new realms had auto-completed the war effort part of the AQ40 quest, but the gong had never been rung. This meant that people transferred over there with the materials for the quest and raced to complete it as soon as possible, and then earn themselves a Scarab Lord title and mount in Wrath of the Lich King legitimately. In fact, according to references online, there was a player that was able to do this some 5 days after these new realms released. I guess they came prepared. Next is a mount that exactly one player has within the game, and these are the Reigns of the Bengal Tiger. This tiger was given to Amara as part of her Make-A-Wish to Blizzard, along with the Jennifer Battle Pet, her puzzle, Amara's own NPC, and a song she wrote for the game. In the run-up to Classic, there was an interesting story kind of related to this shared from Tom Chilton, where there was some promo footage that showed a Night Elf on an orange mount, which Chris Metzen pulled, as apparently this just wasn't a fitting mount palette for Night Elves. I mean, there is the Zulian Tiger from ZG, or even more recently the Golden Saber Cat from Season of Discovery, but these are tigers raised by trolls, I suppose. This makes the Bengal Tiger even more special and totally unique within the World of Warcraft universe for its owner. And at the number 1 spot is a mount which is said to not even exist anymore, though chances are pretty high that you've heard of it. The ever-elusive fluorescent green Mechanostrider. The story of the mount goes that that the player Nash had deleted their Mechanostrider mount somehow and contacted a GM and asked for it to be returned. The GM who responded accidentally gave them the fluorescent green Mechanostrider instead of a model that was available to players through vendors, effectively making this the only version of this mount to ever have been available in World of Warcraft. Well, unless we are counting the fluorescent green Mechanostrider that dropped from Mechaneer Thermoplug during Season of Discovery, which was a very nice reference from Blizzard here, but of course people who have that mount are still in that version of the game. However, it would seem as though this unique Mechanostrider skin doesn't even exist anymore. Several comments on Wowhead say something along the lines of, Nash of the EU Realm Frostmane had this mount from early Burning Crusade up until patch 6.2, and Nash posted themselves that the mount was removed from their journal. The reasoning for this removal was allegedly that the owner had tried to sell the account, and given the very unique selling point of it, I guess in one way or another Blizzard caught wind of this and were not best pleased and removed it from their journal, which makes the fluorescent green Mechanostrider not only the rarest mount in the game, but perhaps the only mount to ever have been fully removed from the game, even to the extent of not being in a player's journal anymore. Titles in World of Warcraft have always been one of the most sought after ways to show off your accomplishments, whether it's proving you're a master of PvP, that you've conquered the hardest raid content, or that you were simply there at the right moment in WoW's history. Titles let you broadcast your achievements to everyone you come across, but some titles go beyond being just prestigious. Some of them are super rare, and that's because they're not just difficult to earn anymore, they are impossible to earn. Through patches, expansions, and the natural progression of the game, certain titles have been locked away forever, making players who earn them part of an exclusive club that can never grow. So today I wanted to go over 10 of the rarest unobtainable titles in World of Warcraft, looking at what made each one special, how players originally earned them, and why they can never be obtained again. Some required incredible skills, some a lot of grinding, but however you got them, they're definitely something that makes you stand out. So with all that said, let's get started. Starting off at number 10 is the Mistwalker title from Mists of Pandaria's Challenge Mode Dungeons. Challenge Mode Dungeons were Blizzard's first real attempt at creating timed, high-difficulty 5-player content which tested your skill rather than just your gear. When you entered a challenge mode, your gear was normalized to a specific item level, meaning you couldn't just outgear the content, and you had to execute the mechanics properly and plan your route efficiently throughout the dungeon. The Mistwalker title specifically was awarded to players who achieved a realm best time in any challenge mode dungeon. In fact, each actual dungeon had its own temporary title while you held the record. You had Siegebreaker for Siege of Nuzal Temple, Darkmaster for Scholomance, and so on. These temporary titles would disappear the moment another team beat your time, creating this competitive environment where guilds were trying to constantly one-up each other. And when Warlords of Draenor released and Blizzard updated their challenge modes, all of those temporary realm best titles were replaced with the permanent Mistwalker title instead. It was Blizzard's way of acknowledging that you had, at some point, held a realm best time in Mists of Pandaria. This title is particularly rare because you didn't have to just be faster to challenge mode, you had to be the best on your server for a period of time. I mean, sure, dead servers might have been easier, but on populated realms it was going to be really tricky to obtain this title. Of course, in Mists of Pandaria Classic this title has made a return, but for retail it's just there for people who played Mists of Pandaria originally and were one of the best at challenge modes back then. At number 9 we're staying in Mists of Pandaria for another title which is even more exclusive because this one was only available to one class, and that is the Of the Black Harvest title. So back in 5.2 of Mists of Pandaria, Blizzard added the Green Fire questline. Up to this point in World of Warcraft, there hadn't been much content specifically made for solo players, which was genuinely challenging, making this a new venture to explore for both Blizzard and the players. I remember putting in many hours to do this back in the day, and I can tell you it wasn't easy, although gear certainly did help. The scenario itself was brutal. You had to manage multiple mechanics at the same time, handle ads, interrupt casts, use crowd control, manage your own positioning, and handle your rotation, all while being by yourself, no help from anyone else. and players who completed this questline before the Warlords of Draenor pre-patch were awarded the achievement Breaker of the Black Harvest, which granted the title of the Black Harvest. What made this title particularly notable is that it was skill-gated, not just necessarily time-gated, and in time this title, and of course the effect of green fire, would become something that a lot of people wish they put time into grinding back in Mists of Pandaria, but if you have it, it's definitely something really cool to have that absolutely stands out. Coming in at number 8, I want to cover two titles together here, Champion of the Naru and Hand of Adal, both achievement titles from the Burning Crusade. These titles both represented a time which doesn't exist anymore in World of Warcraft, and a way of doing things that Blizzard have moved away from, and that is proof that you've completed achievements to be able to enter raid content. Champion of the Naru was awarded for completing the Serpent Shrine Cavern and Tempest Keep achievement chains. This meant defeating Nightbane in Karazhan, killing Gruul, taking down Magtharadon, who was a coordination nightmare in a pre-nerf state, and completing the Trial of the Naru questline, which included 3 heroic dungeon challenges. Hand of Adal was the one beyond that, and this required completing the Battle for Mount Hyjal and the Black Temple achievement chains. Access to Mount Hyjal was only granted by defeating Lady Vash and Kael'thas Sunstrider for their Vials of Eternity. Blizzard did remove these achievement requirements in a later patch of TBC originally, because people were having to re-gear and re-attune ults through all the raiding content, and that was making finding new people to raid a bit more difficult than it should have been. However, the titles themselves were added in much later patches and not directly after you had completed the achievements. Champion of the Naru was in 2.3 and Hand of Adal was in 2.4. These were very much retrospective achievements for players who had done the content whilst it was relevant. And when Wrath of the Lich King's pre-patch arrived in October of 2008, these titles were made unavailable to get. However, if you did have the quest still in your log and went and completed it, you could still obtain them even many years later, and of course you could re-earn these titles during TBC Classic. Nevertheless, they were a good way to reward people for putting in the hard work in getting these achievements done. At number 7 we have the Undying and the Immortal, two titles that tested not individual skill but the consistency and coordination of an entire raid group. These titles were introduced with Wrath of the Lich King's Naxxramas raid. The achievement was very simple in what you had to do: defeat every boss in Naxxramas without any member of the raid dying on any boss encounter at all within a single lockout period. The Undying was the reward for the 10-player version of this achievement, and the Immortal for the 25-player one. The distinction did matter because ultimately it was oftentimes more difficult to coordinate 25 people and to ensure that no one messed up. And whilst Naxxramas in Wrath of the Lich King was infamously easy, it's also infamously easy to just not really pay attention for a few seconds, stand in a mechanic and die. It wasn't enough for you to play perfectly, every single person in your raid had to do so as well, on every boss for an entire raid. If someone has a poor connection, they're going to be standing outside of the high gun room and watching, I can already tell you that. In original Wrath of the Lich King, these titles were converted to feats of strength when Cataclysm's pre-patch hit. However, for Wrath Classic, Blizzard made the decision to keep these achievements available throughout the entire expansion, acknowledging that back in the day, sometimes the way they handled things wasn't the best for the players. But the rarity of these titles nowadays in modern WoW speaks to their difficulty. Pretty much anyone could clear Naxxramas, but really not that many people back in the day could do it without having anyone dying. And number 6 on our list is the Vanquisher title, a PvP title that a lot of players don't even realize exists. The Vanquisher title was awarded to participants who placed in the top 1,000 overall teams at the end of an arena tournament on Blizzard's special tournament realm. This wasn't your regular arena ladder, this was a separate competitive environment where players from all battle groups within an entire region competed against one another. The tournament realm allowed players to create pre-made characters with specific gear, eliminating the gear grind and just focusing purely on skill. You needed a minimum of 100 played arena matches too to be eligible for the title. The first Vanquisher titles were awarded on May of 2009. What makes this title so rare is that most players didn't even participate or really even know about this tournament realm. It was a separate environment that required opting in, and many players were simply sticking to their regular arena instead. Additionally, it was only available to the top 1,000 players, which is a pretty generous number, but still, Vanquisher isn't a title you see all that often. Nevertheless, this title represents a unique experiment in World of Warcraft's competitive history, and a time and Blizzard aimed to create a more pure, skill-based arena environment separate from the regular game's gear progression. At number 5 we have Azeroth's Champion, a Battle for Azeroth title, and probably one of the ones on the list that required the most grinding. This title was awarded for completing the achievement Phenomenal Cosmic Power, which required you to unlock every single rank 4 essence from the Rise of Ashara update. So for those who didn't play BFA that much, or maybe just skipped it out entirely, the Heart of Azeroth system involved collecting essences, special powers that you could socket into your neckpiece to give you bonuses. Each essence had 4 ranks, with rank 4 being a cosmetic version. This is what made this such a grind, because out of the different ranks of essences, rank 3 was the most powerful when it came to affecting your character. Rank 4 was just there for a bit of fun and if you really wanted to push for it and have something to aim towards. So Blizzard were not kind at all with these rank 4 essences and what you had to do to get them. They were a lot of grinding. You needed to grind out tons of reputation with multiple factions even after hitting Exalted. You needed to hit 2400 for the PvP essence, which is Gladiator level. You needed to Mythic raid for certain essences. You needed to do a lot of high level keys for Mythic Plus. And you needed to grind crazy amounts of honor and battlegrounds too. Some of these essences were RNG too. They came from boxes which you got after hitting Exalted with a reputation, meaning you could just be grinding for weeks and weeks and never seeing it drop, and others were just locked behind very difficult content. When Shadowlands launched, Blizzard removed the ability to earn rank 4 essences, effectively making the Azeroth's Champion achievement now unobtainable. This title is so notable because unlike many of the other ones here, this really required you to be good at all aspects of the game. You had to be willing to put in that grind across the board, but if you did, you are the owner of a very rare title, which can now no longer be obtained. At number 4 is the Grand Crusader. This one's interesting because it combines extremely difficult content with a realm first achievement as well. The Grand Crusader title was awarded to the first raid team on each realm to complete Trial of the Grand Crusader 25 with all 50 attempts remaining. This was during patch 3.2 of Wrath of the Lich King, of course. So let me explain how this system worked and what exactly that means. So every week your raid had 50 total attempts across all bosses in Trial of the Grand Crusader. Once you burned through those 50 attempts, or wipes if you want to look at them like that, the raid bosses despawned and you were locked out for that week. And this attempt system was across the entire raid as well, not on a per boss basis. So essentially you had to be the first raid team to complete this raid on heroic with no wipes. And Uberak was particularly difficult in his heroic version. This fight had tight DPS requirements and combined heavy raid damage on top of that. If you add on top of this the pressure of this being a realm first title, meaning one guild will get this, you can imagine how this became extremely scarce and difficult to get back in the day. Because of the factors that went into it, Grand Crusader is simply a super rare title to see even to this day. But whenever you do see someone with it, you know they were pretty good at World of Warcraft, at least at one point in time. And number 3 is something which I have to include here somewhere, and those are the Gladiator titles and of course the associated mounts. Now there are dozens of different Gladiator titles because there have been dozens of PvP seasons at this point in time, but they all function the same way, so they're worth grouping up here together. Here's how the Gladiator system has worked historically. At the end of each arena season, the top 0.5% of teams in the 3s bracket were awarded the Gladiator title and mount for that season. In more recent expansions, the system has changed, requiring 2,400 rating and 50 wins at that rating. But the core concept has always remained. Gladiator rewards are only available during the specific season and then become unobtainable afterwards. Each season has had its own unique title too, with its name corresponding to the set of gear that was available at the time. So Merciless Gladiator, Vengeful Gladiator, Brutal Gladiator, and so on throughout the years. Each season has also had expansion thematic drakes too. Burning Crusade had the Nether Drakes, Wrath had the Frostworms, Cataclysm had the Twilight Drakes, and so on. What makes Gladiator titles significant is they represent sustained performance in PvP. You couldn't just get lucky lucky or have a good week where you went up a lot in rating, you had to climb to the highest ranks of the arena ladder and maintain that rating, meaning the competition to do so was always fierce. The seasonal nature also creates another unique form of prestige, and I do like that the PvP titles and mounts give you a good idea of what point in time they are from, so you know when that person achieved that rank. All in all though, PvP titles are definitely rare and a tiny amount of the player base is ever even eligible for them, so they're definitely worth a mention. At number 2 we have the Scarab Lord. This is arguably one of the most iconic unobtainable titles in all of World of Warcraft. Scarab Lord was earned by completing the Scepter of the Shifting Sands questline and being one of the first people to ring the gong, opening the gates of Ahn'Qiraj. This was a server-wide event back in Vanilla WoW that required massive coordination across the entire realm. The questline itself was absolutely brutal. Blizzard have not attempted something on this level since. You also needed your entire server to take part in the war effort. This was a massive resource collection event that required turning in literally millions of items, and everyone could do their bit, from a low-level player handing in some linen bandages to the biggest guild of your realm contributing thousands of items. And once the Scepter and war effort were both completed, there was a grace period of a few days before anyone who had the Scepter could ring the gong and begin the 10-hour war. It was during this 10-hour period where anyone else who had a Scepter could also go and ring the gong and receive their rewards. Something else you should know about the Scarab Lord title is that it actually wasn't available in vanilla, and people had no idea they were going to be getting this title when they completed this questline. Similar to how the attunement titles worked back in TBC, Blizzard retrospectively saw what players had done here and decided to give people a title for their efforts. Ringing the gong originally would just give you the Black Battle Tank mount, which is of course one of the Ahn'Qiraj mounts that you can use outside of those raids. However, the Scarab Lord title was given to players right at the start of TBC in patch 2.0.3. Of course, in the classic versions of the game you get the title straight away now, and a lot more people have completed this questline in Classic. Nevertheless, on Modern WoW this remains a very rare title to see, and for good reason. And at number 1 I've got the Realm First titles from Wrath of the Lich King's opening tier. So Blizzard did do Realm First titles in Wrath of the Lich King up to Icecrown Citadel at least, and Grand Crusader, which I've already gone over, is absolutely more difficult than these titles from tier 7. However, there are two differences with tier 7 which make them arguably even more prestigious in a weird way. Number 1 is that there was no time gating with raid releases when Wrath of the Lich King first came out. It was very much a race to see who could get to that content first and be the first to defeat it. And number 2 is that tier 7 was actually very easy, meaning if you were the first to get there and you were in a good raid group, you had a reasonably good chance to earn yourself that title. It was more of a race, and honestly some of them just sound a bit cooler. You had Twilight Vanquisher for being the first to defeat South Aryan 25-man, Conqueror of Naxxramas for the first Kel'Thuzad kill, and the Magic Seeker for the first kill on Malagos. Just to add on to this as well, there was a Realm First in Ulduar as well, and that was Death's Demise for being the first to defeat Yogg Zero Keepers. Obviously with Realm First titles there is one guild per realm that will get them, so they're always going to be incredibly prestigious. But for these ones in particular in Wrath of the Lich King, it was just such a moment in time to be playing the game and pushing the content that they always feel very special to see, and they are incredibly rare to see as well, which is why I've decided to put them at the number 1 spot. Saying that, all these titles represent different eras in World of Warcraft's history, different design philosophies from Blizzard, and different ways of recognizing players' achievements. Some rewarded skill, others dedication, and some were just being at the right place at the right time. But if you've earned one of these titles, it's something that can never be taken away from you. They're permanent markers of accomplishment within the game and enable you to look back to a moment when you completed something which was truly remarkable. Throughout World of Warcraft's history, there's always been players pushing their performance and aiming to be the best that they possibly can. Whether it was back then with huge game-changing updates, bug fixes and napkin maths, to today with meticulous preparation, massive sponsor-led raid rosters, and people salaried to develop cutting-edge weak auras. When you want to be the best in the world, you need every advantage that you can possibly get. From every consumable, known raid tactic and class, it all adds up and makes a difference. And as World of Warcraft has progressed through the expansions, competition has grown incredibly fierce at the top end, and there is now more on the line than there has ever been before. At the start of Uldir in Battle for Azeroth, Method led the way by fully streaming their progression. This was a total game changer moment. In the early days of WoW, guilds would actively hide information from competition as much as they possibly could. It was a race of not just time investment but planning and strategy, and you simply didn't give that kind of information away for free. And whilst there are many reasons why streaming made sense, it would also make the top guilds considerably more adverse to testing the waters as for what would lead to a ban. Imagine planning a huge event and then bug abusing and getting a 7 or 8 day ban. That is a losing the race and then some. But in the older days of World of Warcraft, well, let's just say guilds were a lot more open to experimentation if it meant that they could get an edge over their competition. It was seen more as, we have found this thing, we can only assume it's a matter of time until other people do too, and it's up to Blizzard to fix it, rather than, oh, this is clearly not intended, better report it, don't want to get banned. So today I thought I'd go over some of the most famous ways that world first guilds have caught a ban wave after bug abusing. The first one I have is from a top guild back from vanilla. Though technically not during a world first race, this is just such an insane exploit that I wanted to put it here. Remember AQ40 in Classic? Don't you just hate that trash between Twin Emperors and Cthulhu? It's got to be the main reason people take a disliking to this instance, and it feels as though Blizzard budgeted all the trash for this instance during this hallway, especially if you didn't scout too, because you could scout the raid ID with Mind Vision or Eagle Eye. The Mind Slayers share a spawn with just regular Slayers, and you could have a weak aura that would count both of them. You wanted as few Mind Slayers as possible due to their mana burn and mind control making them really annoying. So if you get too many Mind Slayers, you go reset the ID and go check again. It was mainly speedrunners that did this in Classic, and no, they didn't get banned. Anyway, that's just Classic stuff. In any event, I doubt they had this scouting worked out back in vanilla, so they just had to go into AQ40 and hope and pray that they don't get an Oops or Mind Slayer's ID. That on top of the rest of the instance, of course, which ain't exactly all that short either, is it? But what if you just wanted to skip to the final boss? One guild during vanilla did create their own way to skip directly to Cthulhu, though phases such as bug abuse or clever use of game mechanics don't even come close to what they did. Overrated was a top US guild, claiming at the time to be the only US Horde guild to have Naxxramas cleared, but a few items remained elusive and desirable from Cthulhu. But how do you convince a full raid of 40 people to go back to this instance when you already have Naxx on clear? One overrated member, Cletus, shed some light on the situation here, saying while most of the guild were aware of the possible consequences, we basically had to do it. Since the majority of our guild's equipment is beyond that offered in the Temple of AQ, there's little incentive for our raiders to go there at all. Basically, all we get from there is a nasty repair bill, and the only loot worth anything drops off the last boss, so naturally it came to the point where only a handful wanted to go to AQ because of the incredible cost of time and gold, with little reward. So how did they skip all the way to Cthulhu? Well, if you've ever looked at the entry room of AQ40, you might have just noticed that Prophet Skerum's platform is actually very close to Cthulhu's chamber, right at the end of the instance. It's more or less above it, in fact. But Overrated didn't just find a way to clip through a wall or anything like that. They went much further. Through modifying an actual game file named patch5.mpq, they were able to delete the entire floor under Skerum, allowing them to run straight through what would have otherwise been hours of raiding and dropping in right outside the final hallway to Cthulhu. Unsurprisingly, eventually Blizzard caught wind that a top guild had literally been modifying the game's files to skip to a boss, and were not very happy about that. In one of the most direct and harsh punishments for the hack, Blizzard permanently banned every account with a raid ID matching either of the two instances where they had exploited. Many of the Overrated members would go on to make new accounts and continue playing on into TBC, but this is one of the times when Blizzard did not hesitate with the ban hammer. Let's fast forward a bit into Wrath of the Lich King, our current classic expansion, and a source of some of the most famous bans for exploiting we have ever seen. So Wrath, even back in the day, was a bit of a roller coaster when it came to raid difficulty. Tier 7 with a revamped Naxxramas was wiped out in a matter of days from the expansion launch, and Blizzard wanted to create something for the top end guilds to aim for. So enter Ulduar and Hard Mode, a brand new take on raiding, with many of the bosses having unique ways to enable a more difficult version of the encounter. One of the most customizable fights in the raid was Yogg-Saron. After having defeated the Titan Keepers, you can enlist their aid to make the fight significantly easier, from giving your raid more health or damage, slowing enemy cast speeds, to straight up having a cheat death effect. But taking on Yogg without the help of any keepers would enable perhaps the hardest challenge the raid had to offer, and a ton of guilds at the time were hard stuck on trying to crack the incredibly high DPS required to finish off the last phase before getting overwhelmed. The problem were the immortal guardians that Yogg summons. Without Thorim helping, they are truly immortal, and as the fight goes on, they become a soft enrage mechanic. One guild, however, found a rather creative way to deal with these adds in the final phase. The guild Exodus found the following glitch, saying the glitch occurs when someone stays in Yogg-Saron's brain room, as they can still get threat from the guardians that appear in the third phase. This means if you have someone inside the brain room generating threat with heals, the guardians will try to go after them, causing evaded attacks, automatically allowing all DPS to target Yogg-Saron. This completely trivializes the hardest final phase of the fight. As to the exact way this was pulled off, they didn't specify, but it's speculated a paladin used divine intervention on a player and a warlock uses hellfire, so they both die inside the brain room without actually interacting with any mechanics that happen, so they don't get thrown out of it after the phase ends automatically. Both players use a Soul Stone, Paladin Mana Pots, Divine Please, and activates Righteous Fury, and the lock just stands there and life taps, so the Paladin has something to heal. This means the Paladin inside the brain room is generating a ton of threat, and all the adds outside are still attempting to target him, but can never reach him. Exodus decided to go ahead and make the most of this discovery by securing the world first kill, as well as submitting a bug report to Blizzard on the fact that this was possible. Blizzard themselves were not very amused that they had chosen to follow through with this bug, stripping them of their server first titles, gear earned, as well as handing out a 72-hour ban. The real world first would come about a month later by Taiwanese guild stars, putting on an impressive display of coordination and DPS to take down what was at the time the hardest encounter that Blizzard had ever made. But wait, there is more. There was actually some modern day controversy around the Yogg-Saron fight over on the Korean servers. Before the race to Ulduar in Modern Classic ever began, Blizzard had stepped in to tell players to behave and play by the rules, saying we are watching this raid closely and will take action against raid groups found to be using methods like these, just meaning exploits in general, including potentially issuing suspensions and stripping Realm First Death's Demise titles. One guild, however, appropriately named Innocence, used what would be considered by many as an exploit to secure their Realm First Yogg-0 kill. Late on in the fight, players who have been dealing heavy damage to the adds need to kite them out to buy the remaining DPS enough time to defeat Yogg before the adds start running loose and one-shotting everyone. Here you can see the Paladin running and jumping into a wall, causing the adds to briefly pause before resuming their chase. This buys the raid about 10 more seconds, which doesn't sound like much, but it's super important with how tight first kills on this encounter are. I have to say, I've used this technique all the time back when I was doing Dire Maul East runs in Classic. Please don't ban me, Blizz. It works because when your character is in the air and facing a wall, sometimes the game doesn't know where your destination point is, so mobs don't have a way to follow you. This means they stop. You land, they start chasing you again, you jump, they stop again. Repeat. Either way, what do you think? Should Blizzard have taken action here, or is this just some good old clever use of game mechanics? Next is probably the most well-known guild ban of all time for exploiting, but one I'd be remiss not to cover here, though hopefully I can add a bit more background to the story rather than just what happened during the ban. In fact, I could probably do a whole video on the history of this guild from its rise to its downfall. Of course, I could only ever be talking about Nihilum or Insidia here. Nihilum was pre-Wrath of the Lich King, and a guild that was at the peak of raiding from early on in vanilla to the end of the Burning Crusade. Moving on into Wrath, they merge with SK Gaming to form Insidia. This guild has a long and storied history with creative use of game mechanics to ensure that they were always on the #1 spot, though amazingly somehow only had one full guild ban placed against them. Perhaps that's part of what makes it such a famous moment. Where do you even start with this guild though? On Cthulhu in AQ40, they found out that the companion pet, the disgusting Oozling's debuff, had the ability to stack and push boss mechanics off the debuff table on Lady Vash, purposefully resetting the fight at a specific moment so the boss reset with minimal health and a single player could resurrect and finish her off in one hit. Or Hodia hard mode, dragging the trash over from Freya's room and having mages spell steal a buff, causing them to deal far more damage than they should have been able to. When it comes to a clean record of scoring world firsts, Insidia has a bit of a murky history to say the least. They've shown in the past that if it meant they would be world first, there's a pretty good chance they would go ahead and do whatever it takes. What would finally get them a ban though would be on the final boss of the expansion, Arthas, the Lich King. So at the time, Blizzard was still being pretty experimental with how raids worked. In ICC, heroic mode was released in a staggered fashion, with later wings of the raid each being a couple weeks apart, as well as you needing to have defeated bosses on normal mode before starting them on heroic. And it was Insidia's Lich King normal world first that would cause all of the drama. So as part of the encounter, the outer edges of the platform you fight on are destroyed. This makes dealing with the likes of Defile, which is a cloud that expands when anyone stands in it, harder, as well as completely removing the need to kill off the Valkyr that spawned during the fight. These are supposed to pick players up and drop them off of the platform. Instead, they were just repositioning them very slowly. The reason as to why the platform was being rebuilt was a player using the engineering item Saronite bombs. These were often used by players to this day to add to their DPS, but these bombs were causing a part of the platform that should have been destroyed to, well, rebuild itself. No, it does not make a ton of sense, but that's what happened. When Blizzard caught wind of this, all members of Insidia were issued with a swift removal of achievements and items gained, as well as a 72-hour ban due to what had happened. What makes this ban so memorable and talked about are the fact that the actions leading to it are kind of reasonable, to be honest. Any high-end DPS will use Saronite bombs in their rotation. This still happens today in Wrath Classic. It's just a coincidence it caused the bug to happen. So why did they get banned? Well, this is the Lich King, perhaps the most iconic antagonist in World of Warcraft's history. Imagine how deflated players would have been to see his first defeat, even on normal mode, was due to bug abuse. But it's equally as possible that Exodus's ban on Yogg 0 was a bit of a precedent here. If you find something which is clearly a bug on an end boss and you decide to exploit it for a kill, you are going to get banned. They did get the same treatment as Exodus did too, with achievements and items being removed and a 72-hour ban. In the end, this did set Insidia back on the world first race, but remember that an attempt system still existed at the time, and when Lich King was first available, I believe it was somewhere in the region of between 10 to 20 attempts across all heroic bosses reset. So whilst the ban might have been dramatic, ultimately I'm not sure it really made a big difference to progression. Having ults to do practice runs and learn mechanics was way more important. Either way, a new guild would rise up and claim the world first here. Remarkably, a full Finnish speaking guild, and a guild that would go on to totally dominate the next expansion right up till the end. Aragon. So along comes the next expansion, the Cataclysm, and oh boy does raiding take a leap in difficulty. No longer did Blizzard bother with delaying Wings of the Raid opening or an attempt system, they just dropped the full raid and said, there you go, have fun. Paragon were at the helm of Cataclysm, raiding the whole way through, smashing through some of the toughest fights Blizzard had ever created, such as a second encounter with Nefarian, the Windlord Alakir, and of course a revamped Ragnaros with legs. Though it was the final tier of the expansion, the controversy-ridden Dragon Soul, where they took a hit to their reputation and landed themselves with an 8-day ban. So you'll probably know one of the things introduced to the game alongside Dragon Soul was looking for raid. This aimed to get more casual players into the raiding scene by allowing them to queue up through an interface to see content whenever they wanted, instead of having to be tied into a schedule, a guild, or dealing with pugs. And as a new feature, there were some unintended interactions to be had here. One of those was discovered by Paragon and exploited. Here's what they said about the method they used. We found out that you can loot past loot on bosses regardless of your save status if you zone out and back into the instance. This did not provide the raid with any extra loot, but it did eliminate a major portion of the RNG that would have been involved in simply doing personal runs for everyone. And despite it being LFR gear, this did matter for tier set bonuses, which at the time were very powerful, and even an LFR piece of gear to make your 4 set was well worth it for some classes. Similar to Insidia's story at the end of Wrath, this ban put Paragon behind on the race, and they would end up falling short of sweeping the entire expansion. Korea's Kin Raiders would take the top spot and the world first of the Madness of Deathwing. Though can I just say Paragon's World 4th and Method's World 5th were less than 20 minutes apart. You don't see that too often. And since that moment in the Dragon Soul, it really had been a very long time since any top guilds were caught with bans on the race to the world first. One of the more recent ones came during a smaller raid in Legion, the Trial of Valor. This was also the first raid since Trial of the Grand Crusader to feature a special reward for not having died once whilst defeating all bosses on the hardest difficulty, awarding the Chosen title. But the Hellier encounter was the real challenge here. One guild, Limit, discovered that having a tank die during the cast of one of the boss's breath mechanics would cause that ability to not go off. Though to their surprise, this also stopped the boss from doing this mechanic at all in the last phase. Very diligently, they notified Blizzard and decided that this was obviously a bug, and should they kill the boss using this exploit, it probably wasn't going to end well for them. But it was only some 300 pulls later they had found out other top-end guilds, Exorcist and From Scratch, had secured World 1st and 2nd Mythic Hellier using this exploit with no repercussions, though Limit decided to follow along. After all, there'd been no punishment so far, right? Well, for some reason at this point, Blizzard decided to do something about it. All 3 of these guilds got their titles and items removed, as well as being hit with an 8-day ban. It's a bizarre timeline of events when Limit informed Blizzard about the exploit, saw other guilds exploit, and only after they assumed it was okay and did it themselves did anything happen. Either way, they accepted responsibility rather than complaining about it. A lot of guilds would have complained about it, so fair play to them here. I think now the veil has been pulled back and all the top guilds stream with tons of sponsors and make the race to World First a big public event. Seeing bans for exploits or bug abuse these days just doesn't make sense anymore. Streaming bug abuse when you stand to lose out financially is probably not worth 15 minutes of fame of having your name as World First, especially when the top guilds in the world have the race super locked down right now. Either way, it's interesting to see how Blizzard has dealt with this topic over the years, and how the race has come so far from being totally hidden behind closed doors with speculation on forums to now being such a big deal that people around the world look forward to tuning into.